Can you paint like watercolors with acrylic paints? And why would you do such a thing? Well, today I'm working on the lower part of the painting, the chest and the sides from a front view. Not the star of the show, but if I skip it, the whole thing ends up feeling off. This part needs a softer, slightly blurred look, so I took a different approach than usual. Well, let's start with the color palette. We've got Mars Black, Payne's Gray, Deep Violet, Cadmium Red, and almost hiding at the bottom, Titanium White. So far, I've put about 3 hours into this painting, and if you want to see how I got to this point, feel free to check out the other videos featuring this cute subject. Links are in the description. So this part of the cow is not the main focus of the painting. That will be the nose. But this part I'm going to work on can't be overlooked. Even though it's not really defined or packed with detail, it is a vital part of the painting, and not giving it the attention that it deserves is going to leave the whole piece with something missing. Now, when I mentioned a watercolor look, what did I mean? I'm obviously painting with acrylics here, not watercolors, and definitely not on watercolor paper. But for this part of the painting, I wanted to mimic that softer, more diffused style, just with acrylics. Watercolor is known for being soft, fluid, and translucent. You usually work from light to dark, and letting layers build up gradually. Now, there's a looseness to it, kind of beautiful unpredictability that comes from how the pigment moves with the water. It's delicate, and it often leaves behind those lovely gradients and soft edges. Acrylics, on the other hand, are thicker, more opaque, and they dry fast. They're usually used in layers with more control and more coverage. So yeah, they're kind of the opposite of watercolors in a lot of ways. But here's the thing. Just because acrylics are heavier doesn't mean that they have to look that way. With the right technique, like thinning them with water or using soft blending and gentle brushwork, you can suggest that same watercolor softness while still getting the durability and layering power of acrylics. So why bother? Well, in this part of the painting, I don't want harsh lines or sharp detail. I'm aiming for a soft blur transition that adds depth without grabbing all the attention. It's supporting the focal point, not competing with it. Mimicking that watercolor feel gives me the subtlety that I need to make it all flow together. Now, even though I'm aiming for that watercolor look, I'm still sticking to some good old-fashioned acrylic painting fundamentals, like working from dark to light. That rule still applies, even in this softer section. So that's why you see me laying in those deeper shadow tone first. They set the foundation for everything else. Even if the end result is more blurry and subtle, the darks give the form structure and keep it from turning into a mushy, undefined mess. Let's talk about the brush I'm using. I'm using a round brush because it can hold water a bit better than a stiff bristle brush, and it allows for the mix of water and paint to sit in those bristles until I put them to canvas. Might sound like a glaze to you, and it sort of is if it just remains one layer. But as this painting progresses, I'll aim to sort of marry different shades together to create a more fluent looking part. Alright, let's bring in the reference photo so you can see what I'm actually working from. It's a front-facing view, and you can see that the chest and the sides of the cow are kind of soft and out of focus. Not a lot of hard edges or sharp detail here. Well, that's intentional in the photo, and I want to carry that same feeling into the painting. If I suddenly went super sharp and detailed in this area, it'd feel disconnected from the rest. It would really throw the piece off, and honestly, it would just look ridiculous. So I'm using the photo as a guide for light, shapes, and general flow, but not copying it pixel by pixel. It's okay to color outside the lines here. Now I'm mostly looking at where the darkest shadows fall and how the colors transition and how much contrast is really needed. And honestly, I simplify a lot. This is a good time for loose brush strokes. Nothing rigid. Don't think too much, just put the color on there. Oh, and one tip, squint at the photo to blur it even more and focus on the big shapes instead of getting lost in tiny details. So if you're intently watching this video and footage, which I hope you are, I mean, I'm putting some work into this stuff, you know. But you might have just caught what looks like a bit of a jump in the footage. 1 minute, it's soft colors, blurry edges, and then boom, suddenly there's more color, more contrast, more detail, and you might be thinking, hold up, did I miss something? Well, nope, you didn't. What's happening is that during this painting session, I actually worked on 2 areas at once. The chest and the sides, which is what this video is all about, and the bottom of the mouth, where I work on the coarse hairs and the shadows. Well, to keep things from turning into a chaotic paint along with me marathon, I split it up. So this video is focused just on that soft blended body area. The mouth and the hair details, that's a whole other thing, and I'll cover that in its own video. So if it feels like the painting jumps ahead a bit here and there, it kind of does, but not because you missed anything. It's just part of how I structured the content, so it's not all jammed into one big mega session. What I'm doing now is layering in a mid-tone. Not that bold, deep violet from earlier, but more of a diffused, softer purple with a hint of red mixed into it. It's not loud or dramatic. Actually, in fact, it might not even register much at first glance, but it's doing a lot of quiet, heavy lifting here. And I do come in behind my strokes with a small mop brush here and there. That is to soften strokes out more and make them blend ever so gently into the already existing color on the canvas. I highly recommend having that handy brush on hand to lift off some excitedly placed brush strokes, and if you don't have one, use your finger, gently. While this mid-tone helps bridge the gap between the darker shadows and the lighter areas that I'll be adding on later. Without them, everything can feel a bit too stark, like it jumps from dark to light with no real transition in between. And that can kind of flatten the piece or make it feel quite disjointed. Now this part is all about suggestion, hinting at form, at volume, and depth, without spelling it out in harsh lines. And I'm using a light hand with the brush here, just gently glazing the color in, so it softly settles into the background, like a whisper rather than a shout. But trust me, without it, the whole area feels like it's missing a heartbeat. Still using that same mid-color, I go in between the shadow areas to soften that sharp contrast from that initial wash that I laid down at the very start of this painting. That wash gave me a strong foundation, but on its own, it can be a bit too harsh, almost like outlines where there shouldn't be any. Well, by glazing the mid-tone in between and gently overlapping the edges of those darker patches, I'm blending the transitions so they feel more natural. It stops the shadows from looking like flat shapes and instead helps them melt into the form of the cow. That overlap is especially important because it creates a smoother shift in value, which tricks the eye into seeing roundness and depth, not just paint sitting on a flat surface. Basically, I'm sculpting with color here, but doing it very quietly. Another reason I spend time on this mid-tone stage is because it gives me flexibility later. If I go straight from dark to light, I box myself in and the highlights can end up looking pasted on instead of naturally build up. But with this in-between layer, I can nudge the colors around. I can glaze over certain areas or shift the warmth of coolness just slightly to keep everything feeling cohesive. It's one of those steps that feels small in a moment, but it sets the tone for everything that comes next. And that soft layered buildup, that's where the watercolor vibe sneaks back in. I'm not just blocking in shapes. I'm letting the paint breathe and settle in layers, just like you would with washes in watercolor. At this point, I switch to a liner brush. Now that the midtones are built up, it's time to refine a little, and this brush is perfect for that job. It's actually one of those tools that doesn't look like much, but can actually accomplish quite a bit, just on a smaller scale. It holds just enough fluid paint to glide softly over the surface, which is perfect for those final touches where I want to suggest detail without actually painting every hair or shadow. I'm not using it to draw sharp lines. I'm using it more like a tool for soft, whispery touches, like dragging a breeze across a surface. It lets me stretch out the pigment gently, especially in those spots where I need a bit more fluidity or a slight curve to the form. So the goal is to get those highlights, but these aren't the bold, bright kind. I kept them soft and diffused, like a gentle push of light, not a spotlight moment. Well, this helps everything blend together and it avoids that cutout look you can get when highlights are slapped on too sharply. The goal here is cohesion, not contrast. But with that said, there is a very distinct difference between the dark spots and the lighter parts of this cow. So I do need to make sure my color is bright enough to clearly show the difference between those two shades. And I had to give myself permission here to not be too afraid to go a bit lighter than I had in mind. And remember, acrylics do dry a bit darker. So I had to not go in too bright with these highlights, because that would make this part look weird. A cow has spots or very distinct color changes, at least this breed does, so it does need to show. However, there needs to be a balance here, a gentle approach. It's almost like I'm fogging up a mirror, just enough to suggest softness and form. And I avoid hard edges here on purpose, especially since the section of the cow that I'm painting isn't meant to be the focal point. Maybe think of this part of the painting like turning up the dimmer switch gradually instead of flipping the lights on all at once. That gentle build-up is what makes the whole thing feel believable and dimensional. Highlights that look too clean or too isolated end up breaking the illusion. And the moment you notice the technique more than the subject, you lose some of that magic. So too much sharp detail and it would start stealing attention away from the nose, which is where I want the viewer to land eventually. Another thing I keep in mind here is how the light actually behaves on fur. It doesn't just bounce off the tips, it moves through the strands, catches on texture, settles into curves. So even when I add highlights, I try to keep them moving, slightly shifting in direction or intensity, like the light itself is breathing somehow. And remember also, sometimes you need to give your eyes and your brain a chance to fill in the blanks. Painting is creating an illusion. And by leaving some areas of your work looking softer, even looking unfinished maybe, it gives your brain that chance. It's quite incredible, really. Now, let's circle back to that watercolor influence I talked about earlier, because I know it might sound strange to bring that up while using acrylics. But here's the thing. Watercolor is more of a mindset for me rather than a medium. It's about transparency, restraint, and allowing shape for softness. That's what I'm trying to bring into this section of the painting. Even though acrylics are typically more opaque, I thin them out with water just enough to let those underlying layers peek through. And that subtle layering creates depth, not with sharp or very defined details, but with tone and suggestion, if that makes sense. I think that's where the watercolor spirit comes in. I haven't used watercolors for years. I used to when I was a kid, and always felt disappointed with the lack of vibrancy in the color. And even though you can build that up, watercolor does appear a lot more translucent most of the time. I also don't like the watery wetness. I'm a bit of a control freak, and if there's less mess, that's better for my psyche. I also feel that there's not a whole lot of room for error with watercolor. It's harder to fix mistakes, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong. Like I mentioned, I haven't painted with this medium for years, so things might have changed, and it could all just be in my head. I am really very happy with acrylics as a medium. I can push and pull the paint around, I can glaze over mistakes, or change direction entirely. And it's so forgiving and easy to fix mistakes, well, at least in my opinion. But with that said, I still can pull inspiration and mimic effects from watercolor softness. The way it floats over paper, the way it leaves room for imagination rather than painting every detail. That's what I enjoy about using this approach with acrylics. I can aim for that soft, translucent feel that watercolors are known for, but in a way that gives me a bit more control and comfort in the process. There's something about this method that lets me chase that dreamy, fluid watercolor vibe, but still stay in my comfort zone. It's actually the best of both worlds for me. If you've never tried this kind of soft layered approach with your acrylics, I really recommend giving it a go. You don't have to paint cows or even animals for it to work. This technique is perfect for any area of a painting where you want a gentler feel, a sense of atmosphere, or a smooth transition without harsh edges. Think backgrounds, fur, feathers, soft light on skin, maybe distant trees in the landscape, clouds. Literally, the sky's the limit. What makes it so satisfying is that it still gives you control, just a different kind. It's less about rigid precision and more about guiding the flow. You're still making intentional choices though. How much water to use, what colors to merge, where to soften or darken, but it leaves room for the paint to breathe and shift slightly. There's a looseness that keeps things fresh and expressive, and an openness to create really beautiful, natural-looking results. So if you usually paint in a more detailed or structured way, this might be a refreshing change. There's something calming about building a painting in layers like this. It slows things down and helps you really connect with the process. Try loosening up in just one section of your current or your next painting. You might find it adds a whole new layer of life to your work. Just see where it takes you. You might be surprised. And let me know in the comments how it went. Now, and just before I wrap it up, let's look at a side-by-side, a before and after. The left is where I started this photo. Okay, sure, the chin has dramatically changed, but disregard that for now. That section will be covered in a different video, so keep your eye out for that one to drop. But today's focus was on that bottom part of the painting, the soft layering, the mid-tone shifts, and the translucent highlights. It's not a huge dramatic transformation, but you can see, and more importantly, feel the difference, right? That gentle buildup of color and soft edges adds a sense of roundness and depth. Like the form is starting to breathe a little, if that makes sense. It's those quiet shifts that just starts to bring this painting to life. So that's where I'll leave it for now. There's still more to come in this painting, but I hope seeing this softer approach in action gave you something to think about, or maybe even something to try in your own work. So stay happy, keep your peace, and God bless you. Bye-bye!